Hi everyone, my name's Rich. Today's video is a little bit different from my usual videos on my cars, or the auctions and shows that I go to, etc. Today's video is about the UK road tax changes that are coming into force in April 2025. So I'm just going to talk through that. There are some pretty big changes with some fairly major implications, I think, both for electric vehicles and possibly the car market as a whole. So I'm always keeping a close eye on the VED, the Vehicle Excise Duty road tax as we know it, because I own 10 cars, so it can have quite a big implication. So today's video, I'm just going to talk through what it means for each of the kind of brackets and age groups of cars, and focus a little bit more on what it means in particular for the EVs, where there are some pretty big changes actually. I'm not going to go do a deep dive into electric vehicles, pros and cons, etc., but I might do that in another video. And at the end of this video, I will also run through some real-world examples of what it means for some of the most popular cars sold in the UK in 2024. So we'll get cracking with the easiest, the pre-2001 vehicles, where road tax in the UK is pretty straightforward. So if your car has under 1549cc, you currently pay £210 a year annual road tax. If it's over 1549cc, it's £345 per year. So that's straightforward. That's going up in inflation-linked rise there. So no big change. I'm sitting in a 1997 Land Rover Defender Wolf, so that's got the 300 TDI engine, so a 2.5 litre diesel. So that obviously falls in the over 1549cc, and I would pay 345. So that's all straightforward. And then for cars registered 2001 to 2017, the road tax is obviously a bit different. There are multiple bands for road tax depending on the CO2 emissions of the vehicle, and I'll flash that table up now on the screen. And you can see that that goes up to over £700 for the most polluting in terms of CO2. So, there's quite a broad range of road tax there, but there are no big changes. They're just going up in line with inflation. I actually own several cars within this era. I'll just give you an example. So my 2004 Audi RS6, so that's a C5 generation. So that runs the 4.2 litre V8 bi-turbo. So I think by most people's standards, you'd class that as a fairly polluting car in terms of CO2, relatively speaking, and but by today's standards. The current charge for that is £415 per year. So it's not cheap, but I think, I can kind of live with that for the performance you get from it. So for cars registered from 2017 onwards, the tax is a little bit more complicated, so stay with me here. And this is also where some really big changes have happened, or are just about to happen, and with some really big implications. I guess the headline is EVs are no longer tax exempt, and we'll dig down into that in a minute. So for those cars registered 2017 onwards, the first year of tax was based on their CO2 emissions on a sliding scale, and then it went to a standard flat rate of tax at £190 per year, except for those very low polluting vehicles, so EVs, tax-free in the first year and forevermore until this time. And then very low emitting hybrids, for example, were on a £20-30 type for the first year. So the first change, there is no free first year. EVs will now pay £10 for the first year and then go to the flat rate of £190 per year. So this is quite a big implication. So that's for new cars, but also people who currently own EVs and don't pay any road tax will now start, even if their car's several years old, will now start paying that £190 road tax per year. So I think we all knew this was coming. It was kind of inevitable, right, that EVs would have to at some point start paying road tax, or the system would need overhauling. As more and more EVs are bought, the government is going to lose out in billions in road tax if they don't change the system. So this was inevitable. But I think for me, the scale of it and what I'll talk about shortly is quite surprising, actually. So that's the first change. And those low polluting hybrids on £20-30 are going to have an extra £100 in their first year and then go to the £190 per year. So I'll flash this up on screen now so you can have a look in a bit more detail. And for all other cars, so the kind of normal petrols and diesels, if you like, the first year road tax based on CO2 is doubling. So this was a sliding scale that already went up to £2,700 at the highest level of CO2 emission. That is now going to be almost £5,500 in the first year just in road tax, when they will then afterwards all revert to £190 per year. So this is huge. To me that's a crazy amount of first year tax, £5,500. Obviously the idea is to move people away from high CO2 emitting cars. So I get the principle and I suppose it works, but it's an awful lot of tax. So this kind of first year so-called showroom tax, it's going to be a big extra cost on those higher polluting cars. I don't know how many people will look at this and think, well, it still doesn't offset the extra cost of an EV from new. So EVs are generally more expensive. Maybe people will still be prepared to suck up this very high rate of first year tax to buy a non-EV. I don't know, time will tell, see what the market does. But on top of this first year tax and then flat rate, there's also an additional tax for cars from 2017, registered 2017 onwards, that cost over £40,000. So this was applied for 5 years, from years 2 to 6 of the car. It's currently at £410, it's going up to £425. So that's an additional I guess just over £2,000 over years 2 to 6 for all cars costing £40,000 or more. And that's been in place for several years. But another huge change for EVs, this will now also be applicable to EVs. So not only have you got these a first rate, low rate, admittedly first rate of tax, then the £190 per year flat rate after that, you've also then got £425 per year, years 2 to 6. So if you add that up, 5 years of 425, what's that, 2100? Then you've got the 5 years of 190. So that's another nearly £1,000. So that's £3,100 roughly in the first 6 years of ownership of an EV that's over £40,000. So that's a lot. That's £600 per year that they didn't have to spend, those owners, previously. That's a huge change. What impact will that have on people taking up EVs? So you'll have to excuse, I'm sitting out in the countryside along a byway and there's quite a lot of farming activity, so apologies if you hear lots of tractor noise. But one of the issues for me, or issues if you like, is of course this will have a disproportionate effect on EVs. EVs, as we know, have a higher cost to produce. That's a higher financial cost. I'm not talking about the higher cost in terms of CO2 emissions. And actually, I'll do a really deep dive on that, some really interesting numbers that you can look through on online calculator tools. And I'll just do some real world examples. I'm a bit of a data geek, so I love that kind of stuff. So anyone that's interested, I'll be doing a really deep dive of some real world comparisons over lifetimes of comparable EV versus internal combustion engine cars using these online tools, which are really excellent. The things you can vary on them. So look out for that deep dive video. But yeah, what I was going to say is that this disproportionately affects electric vehicles, this high value car tax. I think it's over 2/3, getting on for 3/4 of electric vehicles will fall in that bracket of over £40,000, so more than internal combustion engine cars. The average price, for example, in 2024 for an EV was £59,000, so that gives you some idea. It will disproportionately affect EVs. I think the impact of this is unknown on the market, but all this is in the context of there being some kind of level of saturation, I think, in the market about how many people will take up EVs anyway. So some people will just be anti the globalist green agenda in their opinion. Some people will think that EVs do not suit their use case at all and therefore can't get one. There'll be people who just simply can't afford one because they're so much more expensive. So where is the saturation point in the market? I don't know, but this is in the context of the UK zero emission mandate, which mandates that 80% of new vehicles must be zero emission by 2030. That number is 22% for last year, 2024, and 28% for this year, 2025. So I'll put up now on the screen a chart showing the percentage of vehicles registered in the UK that were zero emission. And you can see there's a steep increase in the early years of this chart, but it's definitely flattening off and levelling off. Now, what do all these additional tax changes mean and impact on that? We're already falling behind the government's target, whatever you might think of it. We're a long way short of that. These changes are surely just going to have an impact on the ability to meet those targets, in my opinion. Perhaps not. There's also a heavy penalty on internal combustion engine cars. So will people think, oh, well, the penalty on EVs is less bad and still go for those? I'm not so sure. Only time will tell here, I think. Yeah, you also look at the light goods vehicles on this chart. They were meant to be 10% of sales by 2024 last year, and you can see that they actually dropped from 2023 to 2024 to sit at only 4.2%. So, it's going the wrong way. And I don't think any of these changes will be helpful. Really interested to hear what you think. And I guess the other way this could go is that people just stop buying new cars altogether. Either hang on to their existing cars or buy second-hand cars. This chart is quite interesting. It shows the number of new and used cars sold over the last 20 years or so, and you can see that actually the proportion of new cars sold is less now in 2023 than it was 20 years ago. Now, of course, we had this strange COVID period with manufacturing problems, etc. But also remember, we've got 10 million more people in the country in that time as well. So, that's another scenario. People just don't buy new cars, I think. As I say, time will tell. Maybe this additional penalty on internal combustion engine cars really does help people move to EVs. I don't know. Let me know in the comments what you think. It's a really divisive conversation always about EVs, etc. I think they have a use case for sure. I'm a petrol head, so I like internal combustion, and I think hybrids and internal combustion engines still have use cases. So I'm not for 100% EV, but they certainly, of course, have use cases. So anyway, let me know your thoughts in the comment. I think the additional context here is to remember how much the government is still getting in road tax. So estimates for the 27-28 year are £9.4 billion in road tax annually in the UK. And that has grown from 5.8 billion in 2016, so the year before a lot of changes came in 2017. So, I'll let you be the judge of whether in 10 years an 80% increase in road tax is justifiable, and whether you think it's being spent well, but those are the figures. In my opinion, this is just the start of it. This is the opening of the floodgates to much greater tax on all cars and massively more on internal combustion engine in the future. I think this is, as I say, just the start. Maybe I'm wrong, but we'll see. So, I draw the comparison. Before I go into some real world examples, I draw the comparison to France, and thank goodness we don't live there. Their top bracket for tax for the highest CO2 emitting car is, wait for it, 70,000 euros. That is just mental. So, you cannot sell a car that's that high polluting in France. I suppose the exception might be multi-million-dollar cars or £100,000 cars where people don't care about an extra 70,000 euro. But it basically rules out any high emitting car being sold in France. Who's going to pay 70,000 extra in tax? On top of that, of course, we've got another problem with EVs. We all know that they're much heavier than their internal combustion engine counterparts. Crazy figures. And because of that, they, of course, emit more other types of pollution. For example, brake dust, one of the biggest pollutants, because of their extra weight. Now, in France, they're doing something, I can see the sense in it. They're starting to introduce a tax, I think from, is it 16 or 1,800 kilos? I'll put some figures up shortly. Of a weight tax, effectively. And these annual taxes are huge. So let's take the example of the new M5. It's now hybrid, of course, so its CO2 emissions are low, so the taxes related to the CO2 emissions are actually not bad. But it's a heavy one, so it's 2450, nearly 2.5 tons for an M5. Crazy weight. And because of that, in France, it will incur over 18,000 euros in tax due to its weight, and I'll put these figures up now. So there we go. Thank goodness you don't live in France, but here are some real world examples for the UK and what it means for some of the most popular cars that were sold in 2024 in terms of tax and the changes. Let me know how you think this will affect the market. Really interested to hear comments. So I'll just rattle through some of these kind of examples of some of the most popular cars sold in the UK in 24. And it's really just to highlight that all these different tax rules make it quite difficult, and it's going to be manufacturer dependent, and what the cost of the vehicle, what the CO2 emissions. It's going to be a headache for manufacturers and for for people buying cars as well. So I'll show you what I mean. So take the, I think, second most popular car by volume of sales in 2024 in the UK. The top row shows the most efficient version of the Sportage. Now, because that's over £40,000, you know, you have quite a lot of tax here. So, you know, that works out over the first 6 years, despite being the most efficient car in terms of CO2 emissions at nearly £3,200. Yet the most emitting car in terms of CO2, because it's that much cheaper, only works out at £1,500. So, you know, there's a real conundrum here. But then if we look at the Qashqai, the Nissan Qashqai, which was the most popular car in the UK for many years in terms of sales, this contrasts now. So here you can see that the hybrid version of the car would only cost you £1,370 over the first 6 years. But conversely, the more polluting petrol is over £40,000, and its first year's showroom tax is doubling to £1,360. So that car ends up costing you £4,500 in tax in the first 6 years. So that's really going to push people towards that hybrid model, I suspect, which is the opposite of the Sportage. So I'm just highlighting here how, you know, model and range and manufacturer dependent it is. It's a real headache, I think. And then we look at the kind of popular Golf models here. So the least polluting is their 2-litre diesel, I think. And despite a doubling of that first year showroom tax to £440, it still works out at only £1,400 in tax, road tax, over the first 6 years. Golf R, obviously their performance model, 2-litre turbo, 300, what is it now, 30 horsepower-ish, four-wheel drive. That's over 40 grand. It's also high emitting relatively in CO2. So first year showroom tax of nearly £2,200 plus the expensive car tax and the flat rate annual tax works out as, you know, well over £5,000. So, you know, getting on for £1,000 a year in the first 6 years now, just in road tax for a Golf R. Some pretty big numbers, I think. And just for comparison, of course, we've got one of the most popular EVs sold in the UK, the Tesla Model Y. This example, the long-range rear-wheel drive version, £47,000. So you pay the expensive car tax. You've, of course, now got, after the first year, the 190, I think going up to 195, in fact, flat annual rate tax. So even that Model Y is £3 grand over the first 6 years. So, you know, maybe people look at that and say, well, you know, it's not actually that much more in tax for a performance model that I actually want, rather than in some people's view, a less inspiring EV. So I'm not sure about this government policy. What do you think? So, as I say, I'll be doing some deeper dives on EVs, particularly comparisons in terms of lifelong emissions, where I found some really interesting data. Watch out for that. Check out some other videos on my channel, and thank you very much for watching.